We don't have trains, but we do have planes and automobiles on this Atari archive. Atari's Pac-Man is the 300-pound gorilla in the room of the home video game market circa March 1982, but it was not alone in debuting that month. Activision published a pair of new releases alongside Atari's arcade conversion, both very different takes on what is essentially time trial racing mechanics, and ones that continue to showcase why Activision had the best visual developers on the VCS to date. The first of these we'll be looking at is Steve Cartwright's debut game, Barnstorming. True to its racing roots, Barnstorming is all about clearing the course as quickly as you can to get the shortest time possible. You control a biplane and must fly through a series of barns to complete your run. Depending on the game type, you have 10, 15, or 25 barns to fly through, and if you miss one, you'll have to make it up at the end of the course, where any additional barns are added. The button on the controller works as your throttle, speeding up the plane while held down. Effective speed control is the name of the game here, as you need to dodge windmills and flocks of geese to keep your speed up. Crashing into either or the exterior of a barn will shock you back down to the minimum flying speed. The left difficulty switch adjusts how large the clearance is for the barns, effectively how high you can fly to still make it through, while the right switch adjusts how many geese there are. The first three game types all have fixed courses that one can reasonably memorize with enough practice, while the fourth game type generates a random course of 25 barns you need to adjust to on the fly. Steve Cartwright, the first new developer at Activision past the initial gang of four, gave an in-depth interview with Ferg from the 2600 Game by Game podcast back in 2020, which is where many of these details stem from. Prior to Activision, Cartwright worked at National Semiconductor with David Crane, who he had gone to college with while studying hardware engineering. National Semiconductor was where he got his first hands-on experience with computers writing BASIC code. Prior to that, he had only used punch cards in university and had to be mailed out to run a program. His college days is where he first encountered a video game, Atari's Outlaw, or possibly Midway's Gunfight with some misremembered details, though it was some years before he paid much more attention to them. Cartwright worked for National Semiconductor for some time after Crane had left for Atari, moving on eventually to teach for about a year before Crane, who he'd been playing tennis with alongside Alan Miller, contacted him asking if he'd be interested in joining his startup, Activision. Cartwright had no experience creating video games and only slightly more playing them, but Crane joked that if it didn't work out, he could at least do their soldering for them and build development stations. And so, Cartwright joined around February 1981 and got a crash course in how to program the 6507. In my correspondence with Cartwright, he mentioned that at the time he arrived, Activision's development systems were custom VCS emulators designed by Crane with custom code writing and debugging tools by Bob Whitehead, all running on a DEC PDP-11 mini-computer set up in the back room. Compiling a 4K program took about 20 minutes with this arrangement. Cartwright said he'd reviewed the 6502 assembly instruction set his first day and was writing code on his second. With no graphics tools, all art for the screen had to be designed on graph paper by hand and then written into the program. Barnstorming came to him on that first day with Activision, Cartwright recounted, as he saw a biplane flying overhead pulling an advertisement as he was returning home from the office. This served as the inspiration for his first video game, where you fly a biplane flying through barns. In his 2600 Game by Game interview, he remarked that it took about 3 months to finish the game. Cartwright delved into the game's development further in the scholastic 1983 publication Arcade, crediting David Crane's work on Grand Prix as a major starting point for how Barnstorming's actual gameplay of maneuvering through the course worked, albeit with different graphics. Following Crane's example and methodology for game development, Cartwright focused in on the visual design first, spending his first months making a static display he was satisfied with before starting in on creating the plane. Cartwright remarked in the interview that this was, to his knowledge, the first time anyone had attempted to make an airplane graphic for the VCS that looked, well, like an airplane. At the time, in 1981, he was developing this game. Previous aircraft graphics in older VCS titles were all monocolor and only vaguely plane-shaped. Even Gary Kitchen's Airplanes and Space Jockey followed that design mentality, albeit with a bit more color. The plane in Barnstorming, by contrast, is primarily yellow, but clearly reads from a straight-on side view as an airplane thanks to effectively using colors to indicate the wings, the landing gear, and the pilot. Cartwright credited this to him not actually being familiar enough with the VCS to fully grasp the system's limitations when he was designing the plane graphic. From there, Cartwright said, it was a matter of implementing his idea for flying through barns and avoiding windmills while adding other obstacles to slow down the player, notably the geese, which required some fine-tuning in terms of how many there would be. Activision's workplace was collaborative, Cartwright recalled to me, with the 5 developers at the time working off of stools and workbenches in one room. Since everyone could see each other's screens, whenever something playable was ready, everyone would try it out and give their opinions. Nevertheless, he said every game was 99% the work of one person, who was responsible for taking these views and their own feelings into account. Barnstorming appears to have been publicly announced at the January 1982 Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. In his podcast interview, Cartwright remembers it being completed in time to be shown at the CES, which, based on strictly the programming timeline, would have been the June 1981 CES, but he told me that once the design team all agreed a game had been fully tuned and was ready to show off, that's when marketing efforts would begin, such as writing the manual and designing the box. Since this process took an additional 3 or 4 months, the winter CES would have been the next big trade show at which Activision typically showed its goods. Activision chose an extravagant approach to announce the game during CES as well, renting a crop duster and dressing Cartwright in a silk scarf and flying jacket before driving him down a Las Vegas street near the airport at sunrise. Described in Electronic Games as the Las Vegas Strip itself, but more circumspect in Creative Computing and Activision's own newsletter. The actual pilot of the plane, Lonnie Autry, then took off for some flybys for the press. Creative Computing remarked that between the 6 a.m. schedule and the sub-freezing temperatures, it was both spectacular and chilly. Cartwright delved into this press stunt in a bit more detail. The idea came from Activision's marketing group, he said, with the idea originally involving taxiing the plane down the Las Vegas Strip in the evening. Because of trouble getting the proper city and police permits, however, the run was limited to a few blocks down a back street extremely early in the morning in freezing temperatures. Ultimately a marketing failure, as he put it. In an interview in the August 1982 edition of Creative Computing, Cartwright remarked that the other 4 designers at Activision were among the best around for the VCS, and tried to teach him everything they had learned over the years, including techniques that they considered the new standard to produce prettier games that played smoothly and featured colors that popped. Nowhere is this more evident than in the background. Barnstorming is the first Activision game to use the famous sunset visualization against a mountain range that calls to mind the Santa Cruz or Diablo ranges near the Bay Area. This had been created by David Crane as part of a practical joke relating to Activision's initial lawsuit from Atari, resolved when Activision agreed to become an Atari licensee. Atari claimed Activision's founders had stolen trade secrets when they left the company, including the Venetian blind graphical technique seen in games such as Video Chess or Stellar Track. This alternated the lines used for the graphical elements on each frame to produce higher resolution artwork than the system could present normally. According to Crane's comments on AtariProtos.com, as a joke, Crane and Bob Whitehead programmed a little demo program for select VIPs aware of the lawsuit's specifics at a CES. Probably the winter 1981 CES based on the timing, but we have no solid date as of this recording. This demo program featured a literal Venetian blind that you could raise up to reveal a striking sunset. Cartwright, upon seeing this, exclaimed that it would be a great background element for his game, and so Crane's sunset code found its way into Barnstorming, and eventually it became a standard visual element in numerous Activision games going forward. The sunset is of course pretty much a gray sky when the black and white mode is turned on, but you can still see the sliver of sun within the mountains, a nice touch for those playing on older technology. To succeed in Barnstorming, you really have to get the hang of making minute course and speed corrections at the right time. Narrowly flying above a windmill or slowing down at the right moment to avoid crashing into a barn or some geese are key, as even letting up on the throttle is better than colliding with an object and having to pick up speed all over again. Cartwright adds in his designer tips page that it is entirely possible to clear a course without ever slowing down or hitting anything, and while I certainly can't do it, he would be the expert. A few guides to clearing the first 3 game types were published, including a newspaper column by Michael Blanchett around September 1982, and in the book, Be a Home Video Game Superstar. While the first 3 game modes of barnstorming may be all about memorization, there is certainly more to the game than knowing where the barns are going to be. Shaving seconds off your time involves minimal amounts of height adjustment, buzzing the windmills, and flying as high through the barns as the difficulty switch will let you. And then there's the geese, which have a habit of flying in groups overhead at the most bothersome times. It's often possible to navigate through the flocks without hitting any birds though, so there is always room for improving your time. Game 4 providing a random course every time it's selected is a trick used in Activision's skiing to provide more replayability, and it works here too. Even once you've gotten the hang of maneuvering through the skies, forcing you to react really puts your ability to manage the throttle to work. Add that to the difficulty switches forcing you to really manage your speed to get through the thicker flocks and lower barn doors, and barnstorming proves to be very well designed. The little touches are great, such as the plane's engine being muted when you fly through a barn, but this game does suffer from the same issue as the much older racing game Indy 500 in that holding down the controller button to keep your acceleration up is extremely tiring on your hand. This is certainly a game you want to take breaks playing, or use a different controller form factor, but it's quite an enjoyable experience as long as you keep your thumb happy. And unsurprisingly for Activision's games of this era, the company did have high score patches for people who could send proof of a speedy time on one of the first 3 game types. 33.3 seconds on game 1, 51 seconds on game 2, or 54 seconds on game 3. Doing so would earn the person the Flying Aces patch. Based on the scores submitted in Activision's own newsletter, Activision's, the set times were pretty tricky to overcome, though certainly not impossible, with game 1 being perhaps the trickiest to clear under the target. Barnstorming was not heavily reviewed, at least compared to its fellow release Grand Prix, but the reactions we do have seem to be fairly positive. Electronic Games didn't review the game itself, but in a preview from the May 1982 edition they called it a stunning visual achievement with highly challenging play action. The Australian game magazine Score's premiere edition from 1983 also praised the graphics and little touches, such as the pilot's scarf animation, and noted that even mastering Course 1 could take hours of challenging play. Madison, Wisconsin's Capital Times ran a column by Tim Onosko, where he called Barnstorming possibly the prettiest game on the market with a real sense of design, and one that requires patience and practice. British magazine TV Gamer wrote that while it has nice graphics, it could become boring. Grand Prix by David Crane is something of a callback to an earlier era of racing games, albeit with far more fidelity than the games of the 1970s could muster. Here we have a top-down racing game in the vein of Atari's Street Racer, or arcade games like Taito's 1974 title Speed Race. But Grand Prix does what those titles attempted to do so well that even Larry Kaplan remarked that it was the realization of what he set out to do with Street Racer back in 1977, but didn't have the experience with the VCS hardware to accomplish. In my correspondence with David Crane some years ago, he said that Grand Prix, like many of his VCS games, started with him trying out some technical experiments. In this case, he'd come up with new programming techniques that allowed for large multicolored cars, and once he'd proven that this was a viable concept, he set about making a game from it. Now, of course, smooth movement is a hallmark of Activision games, and Crane had his work cut out for him here. Crane had to create 8 car graphics, each one making up one of the VCS's objects or sprites that had part of the car clipped off. To make the tires animate, each tire has 3 different copies of each image with slight variations to reflect the tire treads moving. In the end, to make a car scroll onto the screen and then off of it on the other side smoothly, Crane had to store 32 complete car images in the game's 4 kilobytes of ROM space. To provide the impression of moving, the top and bottom of the screen feature little bushes that scroll by quickly. And that's just the visual appeal, of course. To make the game actually compelling, Crane added in oil slicks and bridges over waterways, which would shrink down the available road space to navigate. Opposing cars are generated in a repeatable pseudo-random sequence. Much like in Pac-Man, if the player makes the same movements in each game, the cars will always spawn in the same places and times. In an article in the August 1982 edition of Video Games, Crane refers to Grand Prix as more of a memorization game than a true racing game because of this. As long as the player learns what cars are coming and when, they will know how to avoid them as long as they play perfectly each time. Some additional details about its development can be gleaned in the August 1982 edition of Video Gaming Illustrated, where Activision President Jim Levy said that Grand Prix's development had started over a year ago. but David Crane had run into difficulties with implementation, set it aside, and came back to it once he'd figured out a solution. This does line up with Steve Cartwright's comments about Barnstorming being developed out of playing around with Grand Prix. Cartwright was likely playing one of these earlier versions that wasn't quite working like Crane wanted it to. Much as in Barnstorming, the controls here are very simple, with the controller button serving as your accelerator, though Crane did add in an actual brake by pushing left on the joystick. As you'd expect, the goal here is to complete one of 4 tracks in as short a time as possible, with each one named for a real-life racetrack: Watkins Glen, Brands Hatch, Le Mans, and Monaco. In practice, the latter 3 tracks include 1, 2, or 3 bridges for you to navigate before ending the race. There are other cars on the road, but much like in the racers of the 1970s, these serve more as obstacles you need to navigate around without crashing, which causes you to lose your built-up speed. This is a problem both in terms of clearing the track quickly and in terms of how well you can maneuver. Much as with real cars, the faster you're going, the more responsive your car will be when shifting around the track. The real slicks on the road won't slow down your car, but will shove it to the side uncontrollably, making it easy to crash into another car. This is indeed a gorgeous game, and while the tracks themselves are set, the way opposing cars are generated makes simply memorizing your way through a pretty tall order. Given how you'd need to test out different locations with the same timing for the entire course, and how easy it is to get the run wrong, there's naturally going to be some improvisation going on to get a good time. It's not exactly a racing game, as Crane said, but it is a fun one overall, even for someone for whom the subject matter isn't particularly appealing. Crane's graphical tricks do a fair bit of the lifting on that front, I suspect, as Grand Prix is an exceptionally pretty game for this point in the VCS's lifespan, and with how smoothly it plays, it's hard not to get into a time-chasing rhythm. Unfortunately, like Barnstorming, Grand Prix suffers from thumb exhaustion from holding down the accelerator button so much, particularly since getting up to speed in this game takes so long. And even once you're there, the generated patterns of opposing cars can easily put you in a position to crash right back where you started from. This is especially frustrating when you hit them from the wrong angle and find yourself stuck on the other car for entire seconds before you can break free. With this in mind, the real trick I've found is feathering the accelerator as you get up to speed to prevent going so fast that you can't react in time to a slow-moving vehicle. While the brake is there, it won't save you if you are still laying on the pedal. There are small marks on the left side of the screen that indicate the 4 lanes the other cars will be driving down, so one can and should use this as a visual aid to try and avoid crashes. Grand Prix also had high score patches available for each of the 4 tracks. A time of 35 seconds, 1 minute, a minute and 30 seconds, and 2 minutes and 30 seconds, respectively, would earn you the Grand Prix Driving Team patch. Players blasted these target times pretty handily based on the Activision's newsletter, with significantly lower times listed in the December 1982 edition of the newsletter as the world records. Grand Prix debuted to extremely positive reviews across the board. In Electronic Games, Katz and Kunkel consider its graphical design the most visually sophisticated yet on the VCS, married to an excellent play loop and superior sound effects. In the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, reviewer Lou Hudson wrote that Grand Prix follows the Activision tradition of realism and rich details, with enough challenge to keep one occupied. TV Gamer called it a must-own for racing fans with nice graphical details like the tire treads. On the flip side, Timonosco in the Capital Times declared that it had arcade-quality graphics and sound, but it was difficult and frustrating to play, resulting in a game that may be better suited for someone with experienced video game reflexes. Additionally, numerous stores appear to have used Grand Prix and actual race car drivers as a way to get people through the door. Ads in May 1982 feature drivers Bill Alsop and Pancho Carter making appearances at local stores in Indiana prior to the Indianapolis 500, taking challengers in Crane's game. And this isn't the only bit of competition out there for Grand Prix either. A JCPenney in Pittsburgh advertised a Grand Prix tournament that same month, while Activision itself promoted the game as part of the Activision Collegiate Video Games Championship at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the second of a pilot series of competitions that the company held to try and expand its market beyond predominantly children. There are even examples of Grand Prix being used to help sweeten the deal for other products, such as actual Grand Prix programs in Michigan, or through a free game rebate offer Activision arranged late in the year, when the overheated video game market was forcing companies and retailers to find ways to move in excess of product. There's no information to be had online about how well Barnstorming or Grand Prix sold in their time, though Cartwright estimates about 500,000 copies of Barnstorming were ultimately sold. We do know they were never named among Activision's million-plus sellers, of which only about a half dozen of their games reached. But these are two of the company's better-remembered titles, and are solidly made racers that really showcase why Activision's developers were the masters of the hardware. Before we wrap this episode, I want to introduce a new periodic segment known as the Crash Watch, where we look at the industry reporting leading up to the market crash coming down the pipeline. From all indications, the video game market on the home and coin-op sides was looking good by the end of March. Warner was reporting massive revenues thanks to Atari, with new highs for coin-op sales and record orders on the home consumer side. Analysts believed Atari was alone responsible for more than half of Warner's $1.18 billion sales rise over fiscal year 1981. Mattel also reported 1 million in televisions sold in 1981, with an overall value in its video game division of about $280 million. At the winter CES show, Atari announced its 5200 game console, while Coleco, Imagic, and US Games all made their debut amid announcements for VCS game releases. Commodore also announced the Commodore 64 was on its way. Meanwhile, at the New York Toy Fair in February, Coleco unveiled the ColecoVision, while Activision showcased the 5200 in action. Mattel and Parker Brothers announced plans to publish games on the VCS, all of this occurring as other companies tried to eat into Atari's massive market share, estimated at the time at about 80% of the home market, and get a cut of those profits for themselves. North American Philips was aggressively marketing the Odyssey 2 and its Casey Munchkin cartridge early in the year, before Atari got an injunction blocking further sales put in place in March, while Atari and Coleco were in a race to try and lock up as many arcade game rights as possible for their respective platforms, though companies such as Parker Brothers and Mattel managed to secure some notable games as well. All this is to say that following the runaway success of the VCS on the back of its Space Invaders cartridge, on top of the coin-op game boom, everyone saw money in the bank and wanted a cut. But even Warner's announcement about Atari having record game orders should ring alarm bells at this early stage. According to historian Alex Smith in an appearance on the Video Game History Hour podcast, Atari had to scale up rapidly after Space Invaders' unexpected success and had a very poor product tracking system in place. Additionally, reporting in 1981 shows that video games were in such hot demand that stores could not keep them in stock, and Smith's research found that Atari had major difficulties providing as many copies as stores were requesting. As such, he said, distributors and retailers started ordering more than they actually wanted, so that the number they received was closer to the requested amount, a major reason behind the impending software glut. Retailers indicated they would have to be choosy about what games they'd stock with so many new manufacturers entering the business, but more specialty shops didn't expect any real problems on that front. Meanwhile, the announcement of the Commodore 64 presages the price war that will ultimately bring the small but growing computer market to its knees. In these early months of 1982, retailers were expecting home computers to remain a small market, due for a big jump with a renewed focus on households by Atari, Commodore, and Texas Instruments, as price cuts to the Atari 8-bit line and the TI-99 4A were announced. Already at this stage, there are early murmurings that home computers will usurp video games due to increased capabilities, lowering price tags, and productivity software, though there are still questions about how retailers will actually sell these things effectively. Overall, there are no public indications yet that things are going to get bad, but these events are already in motion on multiple fronts. Next time, a new company debuts with demons, starships, and pool hall thrills.